Hi, the internet. My name is Ben. I've spent the last 16 years as an employee of the Catholic Church, including the last 3 as an assistant principal of a Catholic school, and Donald Trump made me an atheist. Hey, everyone, and welcome back to How Donald Trump Made Me an Atheist. This is part 3 of a lot. Check the link in the description to catch up if you missed the first 2. Before we really get into it, I want to kind of make a note to my audience, which I hope consists of theists, atheists, Christians, and Catholics. And this is specifically to those Christians and Catholics. I know I've been a little irreverent, and that's because it's hard once you leave the faith to look back on it and accept some of the former things you believed as serious. I do apologize if I effectively insulted you. That wasn't the aim. I've always thought beliefs should be subject to humor. Beliefs even that I held, I thought should be subject to ridicule. So that's going to be my style. But listen, today's episode is the one for which I have been the most excited because we're going to talk about science. 2 different kinds of science. In fact, we're going to do a little psychology and a little bit of physics. I taught science for a number of years, specifically physics, so I have an affinity for that subject. And it didn't cause a lot of conflict internally because the Catholic Church generally accepts the finding of science, as long as you're not gay or Galileo. So it really doesn't conflict much. Okay, so first thing we're going to talk about today is cognitive dissonance. This is a widely misunderstood psychological concept that I Googled for a couple minutes, so now I'm an expert. On social media, you'll see people use cognitive dissonance to refer to other people who hold 2 beliefs that ought to conflict with each other. Or maybe when they hold the member of one political party to a certain standard while ignoring similar misbehavior from someone of their supported political party. In other words, they're using it to point out that someone is ignoring their own hypocrisy. So these are some examples of what cognitive dissonance isn't. I trust that if you care enough, you'll pause and read them. Cognitive dissonance is the awful sensation you get when you realize that some combination of your actions, attitudes, and beliefs conflict with each other. So the dissonance isn't that you aren't recognizing hypocrisy. It's when you do and you feel bad about it. So let's take an example with 2 hypothetical people from the last US presidential election. Holy crap, he's finally going to talk about Donald Trump. Not really. So my 2 hypothetical people here are going to differ on which candidate they prefer, but they're going to share the following beliefs. They're both going to believe that the US generally has fair and free elections, that they aren't subject to widespread fraud. They're both going to believe that the media generally reports the facts as they understand them. And they are both going to believe that their preferred candidate is also preferred by the country and will likely win the election. Eagle-eyed viewers may spot where this is going. As they both follow the election, they're going to observe the media reporting that Trump begins in an ostensibly good position on election night, only to have that position jeopardized by late-breaking returns over the next few days. Our Trump supporter is going to be thrust into a state of cognitive dissonance right now, because all of these beliefs cannot coexist. Our fellow here is going to feel like you feel when I play these 3 notes. Isn't that just awful? It's an awful feeling. You're just like, can you just stop playing one of the notes? Even that's not great, but it's better than this. Oh, Christ, that is an awful sound. It's an awful noise. And you just need one of those notes to stop. Similarly, our Trump supporter here is thrust into this state of cognitive dissonance and is holding these beliefs that conflict with one another and needs one of them to stop. And there's no guarantee which one that is. Theoretically, it ought to be the one that's least evidenced, but that's not how humans work a lot of the times. A lot of times, we just strike the one that we're least attached to. Someone could argue that Donald Trump and his team knew that in advance and planned for it. I argue this. They could argue that Donald Trump, completely unchecked by congressional Republicans, spent months eroding the public's confidence in the election's integrity and the media's reliability so that when this exact result occurred, his followers would know exactly which beliefs to cross off of the list. So millions of Trump supporters were already primed to resolve any cognitive dissonance by fully committing to the belief that the media straight up lies and or the election was systemically rigged in order to retain the belief that Donald Trump was popular enough to win the presidency. So then, hundreds, thousands of allegations were made about exactly how the fraud occurred. And then millions of people like myself responded with something like, well, do you have any proof? And the response is inevitably something like, well, not exactly, but that's how they get you. And even mildly skeptical people kind of dismissed that out of hand at that point. The Trump campaign then made a series of spurious, unfounded claims about vote dumps and poll watchers, but that's all they ever were just claims. There was no evidence ever. No evidence. Then how do you explain the dossiers from thousands of poll watchers saying that they saw voter fraud? Yes, the dossiers. Do I think it's plausible that Donald Trump supporters were willing to lie or exaggerate the degree to which they feel aggrieved?
Government did this to us. We were normal, good, law-abiding citizens.
I would say yes. Yes, I do. But even if you want me to take the Wisconsin dossiers seriously, take a look at what they're alleging. This one alleges that they were required to write the address of someone's absentee ballot on an envelope rather than just send it back. I don't think that's voter fraud. That's just not systemic voter fraud. If there's an administrative task that a voter failed to complete that is in no way germane to their eligibility or their selection, it's not fraud. It's just not fraud. That's not fraud. That's just a thing. That's a way we can help someone out. If you were applying for a driver's license and forgot to list your height and you left and the employee at the MVA was like, I think he was 6'2", and you're actually 6'3", is that fraud? I mean, is that fraud? No, wait, but in this case, for the comp to work, you would actually be 6'2". You would have walked past one of those height things that they have at 7-Eleven if you're stealing things, and they would have seen that you were 6'2", and they just filled it in for you. In this Wisconsin case, they're not filling in an address that's wrong. They're filling in your actual address for you because you forgot. That's not fucking voter fraud. Jesus Christ. So there was never any real evidence of voter fraud, but what if there had been? What if some videos surfaced of some guy in what looked like a counting center sort of rifling through a series of ballots and tossing them away, and later we found out that those were all Trump voters? What if there was something that actually looked like evidence? Well, that would actually throw our Biden supporter into a state of cognitive dissonance. This video looks like it's voter fraud. Voter fraud doesn't happen. Those beliefs can't coexist. So the Biden voter is going to have to strike one of those. And once again, humans are going to be inclined to dismiss the one they're least anchored to rather than the one that's least evidenced. And that's not a good habit either. Evidence of the fraud hypothesis ought to be investigated and examined without bias. Now, it wouldn't necessarily indicate fraud until we have more information, but it's a habit we don't want to get into. That's a long aside about the election, and it was our first real mention of Donald Trump, but let's go ahead and relate it to my deconversion process. In part 1, I discussed how personal experiences were the bedrock of my faith, and that I also suspect that that's true for most believers. In part 2, I talked about how my faith made me feel and act exceptional, capable of doing things the unwashed masses certainly couldn't accomplish. Since adolescence, I've made the observation that I think I'm more intellectually capable than the average person. Is that egotistical and vain? Sure is. Does that make it untrue? Well, not automatically, but guys, I'm smart. Please respect me. And being someone who was more intellectually capable, I felt I had skeptically analyzed certain things that people claimed to be true and dismissed them because I'm a smarty pants guy. Ghosts, witches, astrology, things like that. As a young man, I had examined those claims and found them more than wanting. And I did that all without help of an online community that assured me it was okay to question beliefs. Guys, I'm so smart. Please respect me. My point, though, is the thing that undergirded my deepest sense of faith was all personal and internal experiences, right? I felt God, I felt Jesus, I felt the Holy Spirit. So if someone told me that they felt a ghost, or hell, if they had even told me they had seen a ghost, I likely would have dismissed that out of hand. But then there were times when someone was describing something that I thought was laughably unevidenced, that they would say things that I would think about God. I mean, I know he's gone, but I can still feel my grandfather's presence. It feels like we're still having conversations. Like when John Edwards was like, oh, does his name start with J or G or H or L or M? I was like, yeah, he knows that's my grandfather. I mean, it was his middle name that started with N, which sounds like M, so I think that was it. If I felt it. Like, I don't know how to explain it. You can just feel that the crystal's energy just changes your thinking completely. You also have to smoke weed, but it's the crystal. And that caused me some serious cognitive dissonance because I knew those explanations were not good enough to justify those beliefs, but they were the same justifications I used to believe in God. As I moved from high school and into college, I started to ask myself if my personal experiences were good enough explanations to justify someone else believing in the God that I believed in. And the answer was no. So I knew I needed some more ammunition, and here I'm about to get into some classical apologetics for the existence of God. It's likely you've heard these before and maybe have even heard them rebuffed. I'm going to present them as strongly as possible. I'm going to steelman them, or at least I'm going to explain exactly the degree to which I understood them and found them compelling. But I don't think I found these arguments compelling because I thought they'd convince someone else, but more because I recognized that my own justification was insufficient, that I'd sound silly if I told someone I believed in God because I felt God. So I needed to construct these other logical arguments that included science or reason or mathematics. You may have heard of Anthony Magnabosco. He's amazing. You should check out his YouTube channel. He employs a technique called street epistemology, where he asks probing but polite questions to help believers think about what undergirds their faith. His goal is not to create zingers or to take shots at people. He really just wants to sort of knock on one of the legs of the table and see if that causes things to fall. He'll often ask questions like, is that the main reason you believe in God? Or, if that turned out not to be accurate or not to be true, would it change your confidence level? And that's what I'm really getting at here, is that I don't think for most believers that intellectual, logical arguments for the existence of God are what convinces them that God is real. If you could demonstrate that there was a fatal flaw in one of their favorite logical arguments, I don't think most believers would really question whether or not God was real. I think a logical argument provides some insulation. It just provides a firewall to keep them from having to examine a justification that they know on some level isn't good. My weapon of choice was the teleological argument, or the argument from design. The one I liked the most was something called the wider teleological argument from Peter von Inwagen's book, Metaphysics. In college, I was studying both religious philosophy and physics. Guys, I'm so smart, please respect me. And I tell you that only as a means of expressing what was going to make a difference for me, what was going to impact me. In 1993, von Inwagen puts forward this argument that offers God as an explanation for the specific tuning of the constants of the universe. And here's why that really appealed to me, because I was in the middle of studying Newtonian gravitation, which is incredibly cool. And it can be boiled down to this really simple equation, where F is the force between any two bodies in the universe, m1 is the mass of one object, m2 is the mass of the other object, divided by the distance between the objects squared. So you can input any two objects anywhere in the universe, and if you know the mass of each of them and how far apart they are, you can throw it into this equation and it'll spit out an answer. Almost. See, this operator here in the middle is not an equal sign. It means it's proportional to. Because while these are the only factors that are involved in determining what the force is, it doesn't spit out the force itself. There needs to be a calibration factor. Look, I know there are people in my audience who aren't math people, but I'm going to make this easy, I swear. If you took two objects and each of them had a mass of 1 kilogram and you put them 1 meter apart, if you stuck them into the equation as it is, you'd get 1 times 1 divided by 1 squared, which all equals 1. So it would seem that the force between these objects is 1 Newton, but it isn't. There's this extra factor that actually belongs in the equation called G, or the gravitational constant. And it's a number that seems to be set by the universe. It just is what it is. And the value is 0.00000000000667443. I got it. The gravitational constant is always equal to that. It's equal to that here in my studio. It's equal to wherever you are. It's equal to that in the middle of deep space and on Mars. If you want to calculate the gravitational force between two objects, you need their masses, the distance between them squared, and then you end up like reducing it by the same factor, 0.000000000006673. And here's the thing, as far as we can tell, there's nothing that makes the gravitational constant equal to that value. It seems like it could have been 0.3 or 42 or 0.000000000006674.8. Could have been anything, but it is what it is, and we don't know why. The other reality is that we can run computer simulations with other values, and we discover that the universe looks really, really different if we don't have the figure that we actually do have. In fact, if it was different by one of those zeros, if there was an extra zero or one fewer zero, the universe wouldn't exist probably at all. It would either collapse back on itself, or it would be this sort of amorphous gas of nonsense that, like, matter couldn't coalesce. We wouldn't have stars or planets or anything like that. That's if it was just different with one zero, one extra zero, or one fewer zero. If it was different by, like, 5%. Human life probably doesn't evolve. Like, it just changes the gravity field on every planet ever. And so human life probably doesn't evolve. It just doesn't. Certainly life as we know it doesn't evolve. Maybe it evolves somewhere else in some other fashion, but we don't exist if it's off by 5%. Life in general, certainly life as we know it, is dependent on the gravitational constant being exactly what it is. But again, it seems like that number could have been anything. Could have been anything. How could G have just accidentally been in this slimmest possible range for us to exist and marvel at it? But there's like several of these. There are several universal constants that exist in a small range that would allow for human life. And so we gotta wonder what's going on there. Von Inwagen forwards this thought experiment. He says, imagine you're on a stage and the host is gonna shoot you. He has a gun to your head and he's gonna shoot you. And also has a bundle of straws and demands that you draw a straw. If you draw the shortest straw, he puts the gun down, you go on living, everything else is fine. If you draw any other but the shortest straw, you are zapped out of existence. You no longer exist. Without pain, without punishment, you're just gone. And the kicker here is that there's over 1 billion straws. And so von Inwagen says, you draw a straw because you have no other choice, and you marvel at the fact that a moment later, you are still alive, because out of 1 billion straws, you picked the shortest. And so then he asks, well, what would you assume? What would you conclude about the drawing if this in fact happened? If you did in fact pick the 1 in 1 billion, would you assume it was luck? Or would you think that maybe there was some other actor involved who rigged the drawing in your favor? Would you assume that maybe the host wanted this result and so somehow made it look like it was up to chance, but in fact had it planned in mind for you to survive? He also asks, well, what would an audience of people think if they saw this happen? They would assume that you cheated. They would assume that you had some foreknowledge of which was the shortest straw, picked it in order to preserve your own life. The comparison here to the universe is that we know we had no hand in selecting the universal constants. But could some actor have? And that's the conclusion to his argument. Von Inwagen says, there must have been some rational being at the start of the universe that was rigging the drawing for us by setting the cosmic dials to some value that allowed for us to exist. He cites a specific principle that I put a check mark next to. In truth, I put check marks next to the whole goddamn thing. Look at all this. It's just nothing but me talking about how good I thought this argument was. I thought the whole thing was incredible. And he quoted from someone named John Leslie, who writes the following. Suppose there is a certain fact that has no known explanation. Suppose that one can think of a possible explanation of that fact, an explanation that, if only it were true, would be a very good explanation. Then it is wrong to say that that event stands in no more need of an explanation than an otherwise similar event for which no such explanation is available. Now, there are probably many practiced skeptics who just heard that principle and are angry, who are yelling at their screen, possibly rifling down to the comments to file their grievances. And I assure you, we will get to why this argument should be undone. But again, I'm not stating that the teleological argument is without flaw or that it's even good. I'm telling you that when I was a college student, learning about physics and also trying to justify my belief in God, I thought this was the money. This process is an autopsy of a body that wasn't working properly. That doesn't mean it didn't work at all. This version of the teleological argument, grounded in the mathematical constants of the universe, was one that deeply spoke to me. I could hang my hat on it. I could feel justifiably that I had an intellectual backing to those feelings I got in church, in the Eucharist, and the feelings of specialness that I had in my identity. Now, I didn't recognize this on a conscious level, but I think what really I was doing was trying to find a way to sound intelligent and intellectual when someone asked me how I could believe in God. So journeying on, I knew that I had the existence of God firmly in place. And now I had to anchor my acceptance of Jesus Christ as the Son of God. And that's where we venture for the next episode. Folks, I'm honored and humbled you took the time to watch this video. Please like and subscribe. It actually does me a personal favor. If you feel especially generous, please consider supporting me on Patreon, patreon.com/BigBennyBuckets. A thank you to my foundational patron, Brendan. Hope you all have a wonderful day. I'll see you in part 4. Capable of doing things that the unwashed masses... I can't get anything done!